Uh, I hope that I'm audible. Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harita Balakrishnan, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICSS Wednesday seminar. Our topic for today is an Indian perspective on the Dalai Lama's statement on reincarnation. This talk takes a fresh look at a subject that has been in the headlines, which is the Dalai Lama's view on reincarnation, and places it in the larger context of India's modern history. Instead of viewing his statement only through the lens of India China relations, today's discussion brings the focus to the Himalayan regions of India and their deep historical and contemporary connections with the Tibetan people. It also reminds us that while India has offered unparalleled support to the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan exile community, Tibetans have in turn left a lasting moral and cultural imprint on India. The speaker for today's seminar is Dr. Swati Chawla, who is an associate professor of history and digital humanities and director of the postgraduate diploma in research and innovation at the Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities at OP Jindal Global University. She also serves as senior fellow for the Dalai Lama and Nalanda Studies with the Foundation for Universal Responsibility of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and as an assistant director at the Center for Learning and Innovative Pedagogies at Jindal Global University and the Motwani Jadeja Institute for American Studies. Chairing the session is Dr. 𝐾𝐞𝐫𝐬𝐩, who is an assistant professor of international relations at MIT University in Noida. He teaches courses such as foreign policy analysis, political ideas and international relations, and diplomacy and international affairs. He holds a PhD from IIT Madras, where his research focused on visual narratives of resistance and liminality in Tibetan exile cinema. He is also the co-founder of Tibetscapes, a research collective at IIT Madras focusing on Tibet, the Himalayas, and the borders. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. With that, I'll now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Gokul.
Thank you, Harida. Thank you so much. And thanks to ICS for this invite. And I also appreciate ICS for organizing a very, not just a relevant discussion as part of its, widely followed Wednesday seminar series, but also a topic which should be discussed as Harida also mentioned, as the abstract shared by Swati also highlights that most of the times any discussion about Tibetan struggle, Sino-Tibetan relations is always placed or it's always located in the larger geopolitical game. Once upon a time, it was the great game, then it changed to the great game in the South Asia. But I'm sure that, like me, all of you are also eagerly awaiting to listen to Dr. Swati. But in order to set the tone of the discussion, I would just like to highlight 2, 3 points, which I hope would be adding some value or some insight or some thought for discussion in this session. So I think in any discussion about reincarnation or in any discussion about the politics of reincarnation, one aspect which is always the elephant in the room, but at the same time which is overlooked, is the aspect of death. And I think it would be really inappropriate to begin a session when we are looking into the politics of reincarnation or the statement that Dalai Lama made and its larger implications from an Indian perspective. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that the prerequisite for reincarnation is obviously death. And here we are talking about death of a person who is not an ordinary person. And the person is also, as Professor Sonika Gupta and I have argued or noted in one of our papers, that Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, is the physical embodiment of the Tibetan nation itself. So, so it's not an ordinary person. And the most obvious fact that is something which should be every people should be discussing in the first place, that we are talking about reincarnation, we are talking about its potential implications and all, but it's also about death of the person, what happens after the death. And in that sense, we can conceptually locate it in the larger thought of socio-political afterlives and all, which also brings to the second idea I was thinking when I was invited for to chair this session, that it is also not just the person, the Dalai Lama, but the institution of Dalai Lama and the lineage, of course, is actually becoming a site for a huge political conversation even before the death is happening. And again, it is inevitable. This contestation, the body, the institution, the lineage itself becoming a huge space, a widely contested space for political contestation, is precisely because of the relevance of that lineage, and also because of the different kind of debates that exist, be it the Chinese claim, be it the Tibetan claim, be it how different parties actively involved in the Tibetan struggle, the America, the West, but also the larger player, the most important player, India, how all of these countries, all of these people look into this issue. That that precisely makes this into a political contestation over an afterlife, over a lineage. And finally, one more thing I was thinking, that even though we are talking about different parties involved, I would like to reorient, or I like to center the discussion from the perspective of the Tibetan community. Obviously, I can't speak for the community, but if I listen to the community all these years, all the field work, all the conversations I had over the years, uh, the the obvious anomaly, or the obvious injustice, so to speak, in this public discourse or the contestation is the imbalance, because we are talking about a community, both in exile and occupied spaces, have engaged in a prolonged protracted exile struggle for self-determination against a state which obviously uses violence as a mean to curb any kind of voice and repression. A state which actually enjoy, not just through its economy, but also through its pervasive, encompassing nature of power, the amount of clout it actually accumulated over the years. We are actually talking about these contestations, which in itself is very imbalanced. Imbalanced in the sense the power imbalance is so glaring that almost the perspective from the Tibetan community, or from how the community is processing the death or the afterlife of death, or the sustaining a lineage which most of the people hold close to them, uh, is discussed, or is not heard, or is silenced. And we should also have to think that, are these people being, are the community, is the community being heard, or are they not, are they just made mere witness to many other things that have happened? So this idea of death, this contestation, and also the imbalance, these were the three things that came to my mind while I was reading Dr. Swati's abstract as well. And I really appreciate ICS, a very important platform for such discussions in India, is organizing a talk, and that too specifically focusing on the question, the politics of reincarnation beyond the geopolitical gambits and everything. And that actually holds so much value, and appreciate for that. But that's from my side at the moment. I hand over this to Dr. Swati, and I'm also really looking forward to hear. And I, like the Harida also requested, please post your questions. We will carry forward our discussions. And over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor 𝐾𝐞𝐫𝐬𝐻. And thank you, ICS, for having me. This is actually my third time speaking at an ICS Wednesday seminar. And I think it speaks to the generosity of ICS as hosts, but also the generosity in the imagination of what China studies in India could be. My first talk at ICS was on Sikkim. The second one was on Bhutan, and the third one is on Tibet and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So I think it's wonderful to see just thinking about what China studies could be from a broader perspective, and what is it that we in India as Indian scholars can bring to the table. Thank you so much to Sheetal and Snigdha, Harita, Professor Alka Acharya, for all the behind the scenes work. And thanks again, Gokul, for accepting this invitation. I think the last time we were on a panel together was in Dharamshala many years ago. So it's very nice to be back together. And also I see many familiar faces, not faces, at least names in the audience. Many of you whose work I have borrowed from and learned from. So thanks for being here. So just to get started, a very quick recap, just in case I know most of you in this room know this, but for our audience on YouTube and our wider audience, His Holiness the Dalai Lama turned 90 last month on the 6th of July. And a couple of days in advance of his 90th birthday, he made a statement about his succession. One might have been misled by the headlines that surrounded this statement that, this was something shocking and unanticipated. But actually, for those of us who observe His Holiness or the Tibetan movement, the statement was very much along anticipated lines. So plainly, he said two things. He said that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue after him, and that the responsibility for finding his successor will rest with the Garden Phodrang Trust, which is based in his private office in Dharamshala. Now, neither part of this statement, and this is important for us to remember, that neither part is actually surprising. So the second part of his statement, where he says that this was actually foreshadowed in this book, Voice for the Voiceless, that came out earlier this year. In a chapter titled Situation Today and the Path Forward, His Holiness addressed the question of succession at some length, and he reiterated what has actually been a long-standing position. So he said that the question about the continuation of the line wasn't up to him alone. It was up to the Tibetan people. And he said that he would issue a statement on his 90th birthday, which is why this birthday was very, people were looking forward to what he was going to say, eagerly anticipating it. And he also says very clearly that if there was a consensus that the institution would continue, then the responsibility for the recognition would rest with the Garden Phodrang Trust. So again, this should not have come as a surprise, and that the trust should follow the procedures of search and recognition in accordance with past Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And this in itself, what he says in the book, was a reiteration of a statement that he had made in 2011, in September 2011. So just once more, this wasn't something that came out of thin air. It was something very much along anticipated lines. And the first part of the statement about whether or not this lineage would continue, again, this was foreshadowed in the book, where he says that people from all over the world had been petitioning him for years, petitioning him to continue the line. And this included senior monks from different Tibetan traditions, not just from the Gelug tradition, but from different traditions. It included Tibetans both within and outside Tibet, and importantly, Tibetan Buddhists from across the Himalaya, from Mongolia, etc. So, so much then for our surprise, or the surprise in headlines, which are often, we would note that they're stripped of historical memory. But what is equally important to lay the context for this, and this is, the third point that Gokul made, is when Gokul talked about how unbalanced this is. So in laying the context, and this was something that wasn't picked up in the sound bites following the statement, is what the Dalai Lama has been saying, and he says it in this chapter of the book as well, where he talks about how he envisaged the Tibetan struggle in the present and in a future after him. So he talks about, for example, accounts of the forced assimilation of Tibetan children in Chinese-run boarding schools. This is something that has been widely reported in media across the world. It has been condemned by the European Parliament, by UNHCR, by the US Congress, among others. He talked about the tightening around the Tibetan people's religious life, especially in monasteries and nunneries. Again, something that is very well chronicled. Uh, he talks about attempts to bring about about a so-called Tibetan Buddhism with Chinese characteristics, and he notes that there is a significant increase in pervasive surveillance of both everyday life and internet use, and the fact that any display of the Tibetan flag or of his portrait remains banned. He reminds the reader that the purpose of the reincarnation is to continue the work of their predecessor. So that's what this is. This isn't a question of personal preference, of a quirk or a vanity. Why is there a reincarnation? To continue the work of the predecessor. And he reminds us that the traditional mission of the Dalai Lama is to be a voice for universal compassion, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and as Gokul mentioned in his second point, the symbol of Tibet, embodying the aspirations of the Tibetan people. And he says that it was for this reason that the next Dalai Lama would be born in the free world. Now, this too was something that was actually very regrettably reduced to the soundbite. The Dalai Lama will be born in the free world. And then there was this frenzied speculation about where that might be, and that it was code for anywhere but China. But I hope this context sort of helps us appreciate the statement better. It also bears repeating here for our audience that, as was outlined in the Strasbourg Proposal of 1988, the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration have since then asked for meaningful autonomy within China. So this includes the preservation of Tibet's language, culture, and religion, and not complete independence. The Dalai Lama has also emphasized the urgency for China to arrive at a resolution on the Tibetan question in his lifetime. And many fear that without his moral weight, no solution will have widespread acceptance among the Tibetan people. Um, so again, this is, I've taken almost 10 minutes, just to say, let's understand this statement in this wider context of the 1988 Strasbourg Proposal, of what's happening within Tibet, of how the Dalai Lama understands his mission. And although he has been, sometimes been equivocal about whether or not there will be next Dalai Lama, in some ways, it has been a consistent position that if there will be one, there will be one. So it could serve the Tibetan people, and the responsibility of recognizing it will rest with the Garden Phodrang Trust. So as Gokul mentioned, the Dalai Lama is, no ordinary person. So again, just very briefly, the historical context here. He is revered as an earthly manifestation of Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion. And this is an honorific title, the Dalai Lama, which is given to the one prominent incarnation line within the Gelug sect of Tibetan Buddhism. So this is just one incarnation line. Tibetans themselves don't refer to him often as the Dalai Lama. So the terms that they use are Gyalvar Rinpoche, which means the precious, victorious one, or Kundun, some of you might be familiar with that one, which means the presence, or Yishin Norbu, which means the wish-fulfilling gem. The title itself was bestowed in the 1570s first upon the third Dalai Lama, and it's then posthumously applied to his previous incarnations, the first and the second Dalai Lama. The first Dalai Lama, and I was going to say there's going to be a quiz later, because that's what I say to my students. Listen carefully and take notes. I'm going to quiz you, but I won't do that. But just to understand the context here, he was a direct disciple of Tsongkhapa, who is considered the founder of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. And the Gelug school is the youngest of the four schools. And Tsongkhapa establishes the Garden Monastery in 1409. And Gelug actually is abbreviated from Garden Pai Lug, which means the system of those from Garden. So, when we say the Garden Phodrang Trust, just to give you a little context for that here. And the Garden Phodrang came to be the residence of the Dalai Lama in the time of the second Dalai Lama. And this is what gives the name to the government by the Dalai Lamas, which is called the Garden Phodrang. The governance of Tibet by the Dalai Lamas begins with the fifth Dalai Lama, who is called the Great Fifth. This is in the 17th century. He was the one who established a wide infrastructure of taxation and administration, both in secular and religious matters, which is why the 14th Dalai Lama, when he came to India, he was both the secular and the religious head. And the fifth Dalai Lama was the one who named himself an emanation of Avalokiteshvara, considered the patron protector of Tibet. And he constructs the Potala Palace in Lhasa and shifts the residence of the Dalai Lama there. So the Potala and the Dalai Lama then become the synecdoche for the Tibetan nation. So since about 1969, the Dalai Lama has been, as I said, publicly somewhat equivocal and sometimes, playfully and provocatively, as is his style, about the question of the continuation of his line. And among his more memorable jibes, actually, has been this gauntlet to China, where he says that being an avowedly atheistic state, that is, he said that more obsessed with my incarnation than I am, why don't they first find the reincarnations of Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping? Why are they so obsessed with mine? He has also disentangled the sort of the common Buddhist belief in rebirth. That is, that all sentient beings undergo rebirths until they are liberated. Disentangle that from reincarnation, which is a deliberate formal process through which a successor is identified and vested with institutional authority. So he said in an interview some time back that he was quite sure that he would take rebirth, but whether or not the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama would happen, that's a separate matter. And on this, he said he remained open. I remember in 2004, as an undergraduate student, asking Venerable Samdong Rinpoche, who was then the Kalon Kripa or the Prime Minister, um, about this, about the reincarnation. And he said, and I'm going to say it in Hindi and I'll translate it. Zarurat padi to khojenge, nahi padi to nahi khojenge. So if we need to find a reincarnation, the Tibetan people need to find one, they will, and if not, they will not. So this again underlined, and this is 2 decades ago, that whether or not he would reincarnate depended on whether the Tibetan people would be served by the reincarnation. So there was little doubt, having said that, still for most of us, there was little doubt that when the time came, the Dalai Lama would acquiesce to growing demands for the continuation of the line. So it's now widely anticipated that there would be 2 rival Dalai Lamas, one appointed by Beijing and the other in exile. And also, again, to bear in mind that the succession of senior lamas has been contentious and politically fraught before, even within the Dalai Lama line. For example, disputes over the succession of the 5th Dalai Lama had lasted for 30 years. And in living memory, 2 instances stand out. So, for example, the 16th Karmapa, when he died, there were multiple accounts of his last moments and the relics that emerged from his cremation. And there were 2 rival claimants to the title, Ogyntrenle Dorje, who was enthroned in 1992, and Thai Dorje, who was enthroned in 1994. Each at the time had accused the other of deception, forcing their followers to choose between them. And then recently there has been some attempt at a reconciliation, and they've issued joint statements. And also more recently, the 11th Panchen Lama, who was recognized by the Dalai Lama in 1995, was forcibly disappeared by the Chinese authorities later in that year. And another Panchen Lama was installed in his stead 6 months later. And the the Panchen Lama 𝐏𝐞𝐫𝐬𝐩𝐞𝐜 who was installed by the Dalai Lama, has not been seen in public for 30 years. And 𝐾𝐚𝐦𝐻, who was appointed by China, primarily lives in Beijing and not in Kuala Lumpur. So if the career of the Chinese appointed Panchen Lama is anything to go by, reincarnation, despite the political machinations that often accompany it, is still primarily a question of faith. So what Gokul was saying, it's about the continuation of a line. And that's what it is for the Tibetan people, and that's what it is for many of us in India. It's not a question, and the legitimacy there comes from the faiths of the faithful. And faith isn't something that you can manufacture by decree. It cannot be brought about, and nor can people be decreed into not believing. So that is something that we should bear in mind here in India. And now I come to India's role. So Indians actually arguably have the most at stake after Tibetans themselves in this question of succession. The future of the institution of the Dalai Lama is deeply significant to Himalayan Buddhists in India, from Ladakh to Kinnaur to Sikkim and Arunachal. For many of them, as for Tibetans in exile, the possibility that the next one might be in India is a source of hope and pride. And I'll just read a statement here from the Indian Himalayan Council of the Nalanda Buddhist tradition, which had passed a resolution in December of 2022, stating that the Himalayan people will never accept a candidate that was put forward by China, and they would publicly denounce the move. And more recently, earlier this year, the president of the Nalanda Buddhist tradition reiterated this position and said that the Himalayan Buddhists will accept whatever His Holiness decides. And if he says he will be born in India, then we shall be the happiest people. And now this is something Harita said in the introduction from my brief abstract, that no country has done more for the Dalai Lama and for Tibetans in exile than India has done. But what is equally true, but perhaps not said as often, is that no host nation has benefited as much from the moral presence, from the public service, from these daily acts of love and respect of its guests as India has. So India has been profoundly influenced. Many Indians have been profoundly touched by the presence of the Dalai Lama and of the Tibetan community that has followed him into exile. So just to give you a small example, and this is something Madhura Balasubramaniam, who's here, and I argued in pieces that we have written together, that Tibetan settlements in India that are home to schools and monastic institutions, they have also been centers that have benefited populations around them. So Indians living around these settlements, so whether it's tourism or economic activity more broadly, or the fact that Indian students, both lay and monastic, study in Tibetan children's village schools or in Tibetan monasteries and nunneries. So recently I'd written a piece on the Tibetan Nuns Project, where I chronicled a couple of nuns from Kinnaur and Spiti, who shared with me that when they were growing up, there were no nunneries in their village. And they went to Dharamshala, they got an education on par with monks. Some of them have now become geshimas, which is the highest academic degree in the Gelug tradition, equivalent to a PhD. And since becoming geshimas, they have returned to these nunneries in the Himalayan regions, many of which are under-resourced small nunneries, and they are now trying to revive them and educating younger nuns. So, this has come full circle, and this is something we need to recognize. So what the Dalai Lama's presence and what the presence of the infrastructure he put in place with the government in exile and the Tibetans who followed him into exile, their service to Indian communities, what that has done, especially in the Himalaya. I have about 5 minutes. So just to continue along these lines. So his patronage and encouragement of grassroots organizations have enhanced the material well-being, self-esteem, and cultural pride among Himalayan communities. Now, whether they are Buddhist, Hindu, or Muslim, Tibetan exile institutions, as I mentioned, have created jobs, supported entrepreneurship, and also more recently strengthened India's COVID-19 response by organizing relief drives and mobilizing trained Tibetan healthcare professionals. Tibetan soldiers have served in the Special Frontier Force. They have laid down their lives in the service of India. And again, this is something I talk about in my scholarly work, that Tibetan, especially monastic scholars, have helped revitalize both secular and monastic institutions of learning across India. And here I also want to flag Professor 𝐒𝐴𝐳𝐿 recent work on monastic institutions, Tibetan Buddhist monastic institutions in India. And yet, even as many Tibetans, ordinary Tibetans and leaders voice their appreciation for India, many also privately express the hope that the Indian government will announce its position on this question, urgent and contentious question of succession. And many Tibetans have actually long argued that supporting their cause aligns with India's national interest. We must also bear in mind here that the central institutions and individuals who will shape the process of identifying the next Dalai Lama are based in India. So the Garden Phodrang Trust that I mentioned was registered in Dharamshala in 2011. The second most senior person in this trust after the Dalai Lama himself is Samdong Rinpoche, who I mentioned earlier, the former Kalon Tripa, who is also based in India. So when the time comes, and hopefully not for a while, India's continued hospitality and support will be indispensable. The Ministry of External Affairs statement here actually reiterated something many of us, have been saying, that this isn't, this isn't about a move on this geopolitical chessboard of India-China relations, as a lot of the global commentary and even commentary in India, regrettably, seem to imply. At its core, it's a matter of a people's religious freedom. And this is a principle that India has long defended. And that's what the MEA statement declared, that the Indian government has always upheld freedom of religion for all in India, which includes, I believe, the Tibetans who live in India, and it will continue to do so. And also, I think perhaps in this statement is the germ of something that many of us, again, have hoped would be India's position, that it would continue its administrative and material support for Tibetan settlements long after the Dalai Lama's lifetime, for as long as the Tibetans need it, because Tibetans who have lived and worked and served Indian communities do deserve that clarity and that continuity. And finally, I want to end with something that actually Madhura Balasubramaniam and I have argued, that hopefully, this reckoning with reincarnation will not come for a long time, but while the Dalai Lama is with us in India, perhaps we could do more to honor him. And one of the things that we could do would be to confer India's highest civilian honor, the Bharat Ratna, upon the Dalai Lama, not for the Dalai Lama or for Tibetans in exile, but as an affirmation of what India has stood for, who it has welcomed, and what it has valued. I think that would be befitting at this time. Yeah, I think I'll end here. So we have time for Q&A. And I had a few other things, but maybe some questions could help get us there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Swati. Thank you so much. And I request the audience to make use of this opportunity. Also, please kindly post your queries, your questions, your comments on the chat box. I will take them. But Swati, thank you so much. I mean, I think this is the great thing to have a historian in room, because you provide us with the much needed context of it is not only about the political aspect of this reincarnation, but at the same time, it's also about the historical precedent, what has happened before and everything. A couple of things I will also mention, then I will also have a couple of questions to you. Then we will take up the questions from the audience. I think that's how usually the seminar here is done. For any students who are here, and most of them might, all of you might be already familiar with the readings as well, but I would suggest that there is this two particular books. There are several readings obviously available in the popular writing, especially after the announcement has came. So many commentators, scholars, everybody has talked about reincarnation, its implications and all. But in order to add what Swati has started, Swati has given in terms of historical context, I would suggest 𝐿𝐴𝐶𝐬𝐴N's book, especially Forging the Golden Urn, the 𝐋𝐚𝐬 and the Politics of Reincarnation in Tibet. Just to quickly give the advantage of reading that particular book is, I think it starts with one particular description of what happened in Jokhang Monastery in November 29, 1995, when the reincarnation for the 11th, but the reincarnation of 10th Panjan Lama, which is for the 11th Panjan Lama, when that is happening, the Max Oinman actually describes in detail how much the political climate of that particular room. There were so many party officials, the party was actively involved. It also reintroduced the system of the golden urn, which is the lottery system. It was last used in 1908, which was again instituted by the 𝐶𝐚𝐬. You know, the MO and Swati mentioned what happened afterward. That was obviously the forced kidnapping of the Panjalama, who was identified as the reincarnation of the 10th Panjalama, and uh, appointing a state-sponsored Panjalama in the place of the Panjalama who was selected. This is not something a normal game for the Chinese state. This is something which Chinese state have been waiting for the time immemorial. They were buying time. The amount of anybody who is familiar with the way the Chinese state functions when it comes to the fringes, especially the area they consider as turbulence or disturbance. All of you should know, all of us know that China's state is not taking any aspect of this discussion, any aspect of reincarnation lightly. So that book actually gives clear insight into how much sensitivity, how much political subjectivity surrounds that particular decision making. And Panjan Lama is the second important Lama. Dalai Lama is like there are more than 2000 reincarnations, right? But we don't go after every reincarnation. But Dalai Lama's reincarnation is almost the future of the Tibetan state, the future of the Tibetan sect. The second book I would also suggest is by dear scholar Ruth Gamble. Ruth Gamble has written this Reincarnation in Tibetan Buddhism, Third Karmapa and the Invention of a Tradition. That's the title of the book, in which actually Ruth Gamble mentions about how this reincarnation itself came into the larger, wider socio-cultural lexicon of Tibetan religious as well as political life, social political life, in which she specifically mentioned how Rangjin Dorje, the third Karmapa, or according to quote Ruth Gamble, she mentions that he was the third to wear the black hat crown, and that was a very historical moment. And just compare that moment with the 1995, and the third most important moment will most probably be the reincarnation, which we are discussing. So these two books I obviously suggest. But so I think a couple of questions from my side. I will wait for the questions from students in. But I was also, when I was listening to what you had to say about reincarnation and everything, especially the role India would play, I was actually reminded of a scene from a Tibetan film called Little Cloud, directed by Tenzin Sonam and Ritu Sarin, in which there is a heated exchange between two Tibetan characters. They are like arguing, should we migrate from India? Should we move to the West and everything? And one of the characters who are already migrated to the West, so he says that, you shouldn't stay here. You shouldn't stay in India because Tibetans have no future in India. Because the moment Dalai Lama is gone, the moment the Dalai Lama is not there, then everything will collapse, everything will crumble. And I think I was thinking when I was watching that scene and when I was connecting it with this particular talk, the Indian perspective, so to speak, I was thinking about the precarity, especially the Judith Butler sense of the word precarity. That you know, despite we all know that the political exigencies obviously determine how India is going to react. There is no prediction we can make, like how India is in the larger game of its bilateral relation with either China or US, that is largely going to determine. So the political exigency will determine how India is going to respond. But at the same time, we are also talking about future of a struggle, future of a something which people have been over the generations have been fighting. And within the community itself, people, let's put aside the non-violence part of it. People always largely ask that, we are always given charity, but we are never given meaningful solidarity. And from Indian perspective, obviously, geopolitical commentators and everybody would be immediately jump into this discussion and would say that no, India can't afford to have China as a permanent enemy, or India cannot afford to have uh, a larger role. India can't play a larger role when the situation unravels. But how would you address this precarity? Like as a historian who has been closely following this thing, Swati, I think the precarity from the view of community that it's not only about whether the legitimacy of the institution or what happened to the institution of Dalai Lama, but also what happens to the larger struggle is the biggest question that is haunting them. So this is the first part of the question I had, and secondly, simultaneously also mentioned about uh, the lineage of the institution of Dalai Lama and how it is connected largely, not just largely, very deeply with the Himalayan communities, especially the Himalayan Tibetan Buddhist communities who are, uh, to make a very direct distinction to who are not the Tibetan exile community, but also Tibetan Buddhist community from different parts of the region, what we now identify from Ladakh to Tawang or beyond, right? So, but there is also this, very interesting inter-community dynamics that, if the next Dalai Lama is born in the free world, uh, would it be the Tibetan exile community or the Tibetan community in both sides of the Himalayas, or the free word also refers to the Tibetan Buddhist community? Then it would actually start another set of, animosities or like, frictions between different this thing. So there is multiple. The complexity of the issue is such that Dalai Lama is also the Dalai Lama of all the Tibetan Buddhists, but at the same time, the putting aside the religious part, he is also a political face, political embodiment of the larger Tibetan struggle movement. So how do you see this particular dynamic also at play? So these are the two questions. Then we will take the from the audience. Yes.
Thank you. And thanks also, Gokul. It's good to be with another professor. We always give book recommendations. But I also want to mention just one more scholar, Apa Lamo, who's recently written a lot, short, very accessible, but very dense and well-informed pieces on how China is preparing for the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. So I do encourage everyone to check out Apa Lamo's APALHAMO, to check out her work as well. On the two questions, and I think again here, just for our audience, perhaps on YouTube, I know a lot of people that I see whose names I see would know this, but the Dalai Lama is no longer both the secular and the political head. So yes, he is the most recognizable Tibetan in the world, and yes, we associate him with the Tibetan movement. But at least since 2011, when he formally steps down as the political head of the Central Tibetan Administration, or we call it the government in exile. So there is a process to elect the 𝐶𝐞, and that process is in place. So which is not to say that the figure of the Dalai Lama is not important. And yes, it is also true that any solution, and I think that's what he's been saying, that for any negotiation, any solution, any path forward, which doesn't have the stamp of his approval, perhaps will not have legitimacy among the Tibetan people. So he is definitely hugely important, but I just wanted to make that distinction. And again, the second distinction here being that the Dalai Lama lineage is one lineage. And when he's talking about, how the next one would be found, again, this is not a question. We often conflate this. I was listening to a couple of television interviews with otherwise very well-informed authors who seem to be suggesting that if India were to take this or that position, it's a position on it's a territorial position, or it's India making a comment about whether or not Tibet is a part of China. So again, to disentangle the two, I mean, yes, again, having said everything that we've said about what the Dalai Lama represents, let us not conflate so both a secular and political authority formally. And let us also not conflate the line, which is a reincarnation line, and where he's talking about how the process, the Tibetan traditions need to be followed here, and the authority rests in the Garden for Drunk Trust. So this is one line among the Gelug tradition. Also, the Dalai Lama is not the head of the Gelug sect. That's the Garden Tripa, who's appointed by the Dalai Lama, which is not a reincarnation line, is appointed for a period of 7 years. But so having made these clarifications, returning to Gokul's question, I think the first one about precarity, I don't have a good answer, but I will just say, in Gokul, I share your apprehensions, and I share your anxiety. And I also remember that moment from the film, and it's very evocative. And I'm just going to add one layer of perhaps complexity to it without answering it. This is in the last year, there have been many closed door discussions, a couple that I have been part of, some with the 𝐋𝐚𝐬𝐚𝐧 himself, and some with members of the Tibetan Parliament in exile about this question and what's the role of Tibetans in exile in a future after the Dalai Lama. And somebody asked the 𝐋𝐚𝐬𝐚𝐧, but most of the population in exile, which also has been declining. And the other thing to remember is it used to be the case until even a decade and a half ago, that most Tibetans in exile lived in South Asia, so mostly in India, but also a large number in Nepal. But it's now almost 50-50, so many have migrated to the West. And the migration from Tibet has trickled down. So again, adding to all the anxieties that Gokul mentioned, this is another one. But somebody asked the 𝐋𝐚𝐬𝐚𝐧 that, given that most Tibetans in exile were actually born in exile, and they haven't seen Tibet. And in many cases, many of our friends, for example, Gokul, even their friends have not seen Tibet. So what is the connection that they feel? And, would they even, like, if there were to be the possibility of a return, would people return? And here, Gokul, when given your work, you might recall this film, Who Tibetan, this dystopian film where this man goes in upstate New York, knocking door to door saying, would you like to return to Tibet? And everybody says, oh, someone has a partner, and, someone is in school. But what the 𝐋𝐚𝐬𝐚𝐧 said, and I think that's important to remember, that the Tibetan struggle in exile is not about people in exile. It's about people in Tibet. So they are living in exile to stand for the people in Tibet. And most Tibetans still live in Tibet by far, right? So what is going to be the voice? And I think that's the more important question. So perhaps even more important than what happens to Tibetans in exile, many of whom are actually well integrated into host communities. And again, here flagging scholar Dawa Norbu's work about why is it that Tibetans in exile have been so, again, within quotes, successful, what has, led to very high levels of education, for example. And I mentioned all the good work that they have done for host communities. So that aside, I think the other urgent question is, what happens to Tibetans within Tibet? And if the Dalai Lama is reborn outside Tibet, what does that mean for Tibetans within Tibet? And I don't have a good answer. I'll just say that I share your concern. And this also connects to, I think, your second question about the lineage itself, and the connection with the Himalayan people. So, a student of mine was asking the other day, has there been another Dalai Lama who was born outside of Tibet? And again, I think the point there to remember as historians is that these borders are recent, and the maps that we see today are recent. So perhaps even the question doesn't really make sense, right? So if you think about the Tibetan cultural region, and of course, we make a distinction between Tibetans, exiled Tibetans, and Tibetan Buddhists. But, how relevant are also these distinctions? And is there solidarity? And again, here, perhaps, evidence from cinema, from poetry. Gokul, you might recall Gelek Pasang's film, Prayers Answered. These kids from Turtuk, who are Indian, singing about Tibet with a lot of affection, and they haven't seen Tibet. They were born in India, and I've seen this again, monks and nuns from nunneries, nationalities aside, So what does the Dalai Lama represent? But I think there, since we are talking about the continuation of the line, the fact that these monastic institutions are now entrenched, education is more entrenched, curricula, for example, have been reformed, have been codified, have been institutionalized. So there, I think I do see some hope of Tibetan Buddhist traditions continuing. So there, I think the government in exile has done a good job. So whether it is linguistic preservation, cultural preservation, opera, for example, cinema, poetry, painting, and of course, monastic curricula, these, the exegetical traditions, and has even, like, in the female monastic tradition, gone a few steps forward. So perhaps if we think about disentangle Tibetan culture and, what we could do to enable its continued flourishing, I think there is one answer there. But the other question, I think, I don't really have a good answer. So I don't know if I answered either of them actually, but yeah.
No, Swati. I mean, as both of us would agree that there is no right and wrong answer to these concerns, especially. There is not one right way of thinking also. And I really appreciate and also really stress this point also to the audience that, the 2 points which Dr. Swati mentioned now, that the Excel community obviously is politically exiled, but the community at large obviously represent the larger Tibetan community. They are they are fighting to become the voice of the larger Tibetan community. When the voice, obviously, in the occupied space is not heard, is arbitrarily silenced. But also the second point, which Swati mentioned about the borders, because uh, the entire Himalayan belt or the region that actually ranges from, I mean, I don't know, Taklamakan Desert to I don't know the entire boundaries. I mean, at the contemporary time, it is very politically sensitive to talk where this boundary starts, where this boundary ends. But for the culture, for these traditions, for the people who didn't even particularly care about the boundaries, for the nomadic communities, all of them see this as arbitrary imposition of the modern state system without going to the decolonial debate or anything, because this was boundaries which were created by nation states, and they literally severed centuries of ties, centuries of relations, kinship, culture, and everything. So like Swati pointed out, if you look it from the other way around, 70 years was is actually not a long period of time considering the amount of time this uh, particular traditions have survived, and these traditions have seen bigger crisis as well, right? So it's also very important. I think I also second that it's very important to remember the fact that, these nation state borders, the territorial boundaries and assertions also have a very arbitrary nature in which it's actually uh, literally cutting the people, community, belief systems into multiple pieces. Um, I think there is no questions in the chat. Yes, of course, there is a question from Shreyash Mohanty, who is a research assistant in ICS. So Swati, Shreyas is asking, I hope you can also see in the chat box, that how does India reconcile the competing pressures of not antagonizing China on Tibet while maintaining credible partnerships with Western democracies that view Tibetan autonomy and human rights as core values? Over to you, sir.
So I think, again, I'll first reiterate that perhaps we should think about the question of reincarnation, of our kinship with the Tibetan people outside this prism of what does it do to our relations to China, with China and with the West. So having said that, I think also perhaps if I were to answer your question and pose a counterfactual question, let's say India had not given refuge to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and there wasn't a community in exile that lived in India. Would our relations with China have been harmonious? I mean, is that the There are many who have argued that we are living in a fool's paradise if we think that we would have no problems with our neighbor had it not been for our support for the Dalai Lama. So I'll just leave it at that. As to the second part of your question about autonomy and human rights as core values, I think these are also values. Religious autonomy in particular is a value that the recent Ministry of External Affairs statement also referred to, so it is something that India too has stood for. So I don't think we have to think about these as exclusively Western values. And again, I mean, this is something perhaps Gokul has a similar experience. We also teach about Tibet. And something that I tell my students that, perhaps you don't believe in reincarnation, you might not believe that anything happens to us after we die. But what you can understand, and what many in India actually instinctively understand, is that this is still a question of the people who believe, it's for them to decide, not for a third party to decide by decree. So I think fundamentally it is that question that I don't have to believe in a religious tradition. Doesn't have to be my tradition, but I can respect a community's right to choose for itself. So that is something I think, whether or not we articulate it in the vocabulary of religious freedom or human rights, I think that's something many of us in India instinctively understand and support. And I think that's perhaps also the germ of solidarity. It doesn't really have to be, just with the Himalayan people who have, of course, a historical, more affective connection. But I think on a wider scale, one can see, and this is also about the imbalance that Gokul talked about as his third point when he was introducing the talk, that is something that many instinctively understand, and that's why we support the Tibetan movement in exile.
Absolutely, Swati. And I think it's very important to stress on agency, and most importantly, the denial of agency, because at the end of the day, it all comes to the question who gets to choose their own fate. And if it's actually dictated by others and without even any consultation or any choice, then obviously it's such arbitrary imposition doesn't stand any value. So we don't need actually a Western human rights as core values to even accept this prima facie. So that, sorry, there is one more question from Nainima Basu, is an independent journalist and author. Nainima asks, I wanted to know how you don't see the reincarnation issue as a future national security challenge for India when it comes to dealing with China. And also goes on to say that I was in Tibet last month and visited the Potala Palace and Jokung Temple and conducted several interviews there. And let me tell you, this is a very serious political and geopolitical issue for the Chinese government. So basically, the question is about the national security aspect of reincarnation.
So I think again, and thank you, Nanima. I actually did follow some of your reporting last month. Um, Again, no one is denying that this is a sensitive geopolitical issue for China. I think all that we are saying is perhaps it is possible to disentangle India's position on reincarnation. So this is not, it's not a territorial position. This isn't a position about whether or not India thinks Tibet is a part of China or not. This isn't about that. So this is about what the Dalai Lama, who lives in India, has lived in India, how he envisages the continuation of his line. So I think the geopolitical aspect of it, many have spoken about it, better informed than I am. Two recent interviews that I learned a lot from, both with Karan Thapar, I think with Shiv Shankar Menon, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, and Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao. Both of them talked about this. So, this isn't to deny that it's not that. I think it's to say that there's another aspect of it which perhaps we are overlooking when we only see this through the geopolitical prism, and to say that that also deserves a seat at the table. That voice also deserves a seat at the table. That's all that I'm saying. It's not really contesting anything that you say here. Gokul, do you want to add, since you are the IR person here and
Yes,
I'm the historian?
Exactly. I think obviously national security, one can't deny the fact that national security actually plays an important role, especially in an era largely marked by interstate relations, power of balance, all of those things. But like Swati said, it's also about the standpoint which where you are coming from also, right? You know, if you are relentlessly or unendingly focusing on national security, obviously that is one vantage point you are taking to look at the issue. But that needn't necessarily be the only vantage point. Again, I mean, that's how academia is all about. Like, to put it very theoretically, it's how let's be very post-positivist about all those things because there can
And
be
also, I
multiple
think
other views.
ask like, who does this visibilize and invisibilize?
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
you know, who has a seat at this table? Where are we looking from? So I think another thing we often say is, of course, you know, when we're sitting in Delhi, we have one position, but how does this look from Gangtok, you know, or from Kinnaur, or from Spiti, or from Tawang, or Leh? So would we have a different position? And does that position, you know, shouldn't that be voiced as much as this? Yeah, sorry,
Exactly.
Gokul, I interrupted you.
No, exactly. I also agree to the fact that even not just reincarnation, like you accurately mentioned, reincarnation is not the only issue that is happening between India and China. There is an unsettled border. There are population on two sides of the border. I mean, many of these discussions, many of these escalations, how many people actually take into consideration the voice of the people who are living in the boundary? So, but yes, national security is always the game between states. National security is always a game reserved for the states. But as scholars, as practitioners, as people who are observers of this development, it is it is okay to also discuss other aspects, right? So that's what I think. And I think there is no more questions. So I hand over now this thing to ICS Delhi. So please take forward.
Thank you, Nangsel Sherpa here. Nice to see you. I think she's dropped out. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. With your permission, I'll formally close today's session.
Thank you. Thanks for
Uh,
having me.
On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, we sincerely thank Dr. Swati Chawla for her thought-provoking talk and Dr. Gokul for chairing this discussion and offering valuable insights. We also thank all our participants for joining us today and engaging with the topic. We look forward to seeing you at our upcoming Wednesday seminars, and details are available on the ICS website, and you can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you once again, and I hope you have a good evening.